for decades. The benefits are clear when you're dealing with a physically interdependent substance like water resource. Some countries have moved towards an IWRM approach, but many haven't. Why not? Because the sectors are highly segmented. There's a hell of a lot of politics in water. And we haven't basically analysed well enough the enormous barriers to coordination and integration. And that is a research area. If you're looking for research areas that I think has got an awful lot of mileage. What are the barriers? Water to me seems a classic because it very much is a win-win set of measures that are justifiable in the absence of climate change. And yet it doesn't happen. Why not? That, to me, is quite a critical question. Just in the run-up to the end, you'll be pleased to know, I just want to say, planned adaptation, again, there's a debate about this, because it's fairly clear that over time adaptation costs are going to be huge. And governments will need to share that cost burden with the private sector. And I'm using private sector widely again, and I'm also including sharing the costs, including with people still bearing the losses, because that would be a sharing of the costs. Now, it's usually argued, if you're an economics purist, that the government should concentrate on public goods only. Public goods, and there are lots of them. Information, coastal, flood wars. You know public goods as well as I do. And they usually also argue that if the benefits are going to the private sector, private individuals and private groups, communities, then those groups, communities, individuals should have the incentives to make the adaptation decisions for themselves. Now, in the real world, it's not quite as simple as that. In the first place, governments own a hell of a lot of state businesses. In the UK, less so now, as they've been sold off. But in India, there's still a lot of state-run enterprises, one way or another. And those have assets vulnerable to climate change. Now, if these state-run enterprises were exceptionally well-run, they were returning adequate revenue streams to cover their investment costs, then it may be possible for them to borrow, as sound financial institution, to borrow in order to put the climate change extra. But very often, and certainly in my experience, there are an awful lot of state-run businesses that are not making enough revenue to even cover their running costs, never mind their investment costs. That's certainly so in the water sector. Yeah. And so, it is highly unlikely, under those conditions, that you're going to get private finance, or even private refinance. So, in the real world, you've also got the government, not only public goods, but also those state-run enterprises that cannot attract loans from financial institutions simply because they can't pay them back. And we've also got another quite important issue, is that there's started to be some evidence that we may get withdrawals of people who would insure against climate losses. And this is again an area where governments may have to play a role. Okay, and the second place is, I've already argued, that autonomous adaptation is not necessarily automatically a good thing. Now, a lot of economists, including Nick Stern, have had in the past tended to assume it was. But it isn't. And that's partly because of the barriers to adaptation and the need for governments to reduce the barriers to adaptation before it can take place. But it's also the fact that you've got short-term responses that will be incompatible with the long-term needs. You've got the opportunity costs that I mentioned before of premature or ineffective adaptation. You've got maladaptation, right? And that is where you're actually making things worse by making investments that are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. Building something on a floodplain is a fairly obvious example. You've also got, and I mentioned externalities, you've got inequity, and you've got the question of whether it's all compatible with the government's roles, with societal roles. And in reality, governments have a huge amount to do. Let's go on to 2 slides. Direct investment they will need, trying to address the adaptation deficit, trying to think of bringing in other sources of finance, improving our knowledge, disseminating that knowledge, controlling the maladaptation. And that's Mumbai, where you could argue there was a lot of maladaptation going on. And that's only the start of it. You've then got the question of regulating the negative externalities, developing and implementing a whole series of policy instruments, markets, non-market, in a policy mix, trying to remove some of the barriers to adaptation and pursue sustainable development strategies to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience. So there's a package for government. From what I have read about India, and it's very limited, right? This last one is being concentrated on, but not thinking about a whole overall package. So I think we as social scientists may have got quite a bit of work still to do. Finally, I just want to stress one thing. And that is that it's become something of a mantra that development is the best form of adaptation. It's been around now about 20 years. Okay? But it is a mantra, and to a certain extent it's true. Right? But it can't be then assumed, right, well, all we have to do is develop, we don't have to worry about adaptation. Because that would be rather a mistake. And we need to think about those forms of growth that are not compatible with climate change. And we could also do with paying much more attention to the studies that are starting to come out about the pathways of growth that are associated with high vulnerability and high risk. And I've just listed some. High dependence on labour-intensive agro-businesses, low diversification of output, low flexibility in labour and product markets, low openness to international trade, limited financial markets, poor governance institutions, and things like literacy also come up. And thinking about, okay, well, in our development strategies, are we also perhaps thinking of those that may be associated with reducing the vulnerability? These are only associations, and there's still a lot of work still to do. It's a different way of thinking about the problems and the issues. Some little messages, maybe. Adaptation, to me, can't be just about crisis management. Right?